Captain Marcus Kane stood at the observation deck of Artemis, the flagship of the United Earth Fleet, staring out at the endless expanse of space. The stars, distant and cold, twinkled like forgotten memories, while the deep silence of the frontier made the void feel even more oppressive. Humanity's outposts in this corner of the galaxy had been at peace for decades, but that peace had become a weary lull. Kane couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. He was a soldier, a man who had seen too much war to find comfort in stillness. The rest of the crew, young and eager, talked about missions and dreams of a future free from conflict. But Kane knew better. He had learned that the quiet before a storm was always the most dangerous time. And today, the storm would arrive. It started as a routine transmission, a pulse of energy, weak and fragmented, barely noticeable amidst the background noise of the galaxy. The tech crew at the communications station barely registered it at first, but Lieutenant Sarah Westbrook, the fleet's chief communications officer, had an eye for anomalies. She tracked it down with methodical precision, her fingers flying over the controls. "Captain, you should see this," Westbrook said, her voice tight with surprise. Kane stepped over, glancing at the display. A barely audible signal was coming from a distant sector on the edge of human space, a region known for its barren, uninhabited planets. At first glance, it seemed like nothing, just another stray signal from an ancient satellite or deep space probe. But there was something odd about its pattern, something that tugged at Kane's memory. "What is it?" Kane asked, his voice low. "I don't know, sir," Westbrook replied, furrowing her brow. "It's not standard human technology. And it's old. Very old." The signal was pulsing in a strange sequence, repeating every few seconds. It felt like a code, like a message, but it was in a language no one could recognize. Westbrook's fingers hovered over the panel. "It's definitely not human," she said, uncertainty in her tone. Kane's instincts flared. There were few things that could make him nervous, but this felt wrong. Too much time had passed since humanity had dealt with anything that wasn't a calculated threat, and what unnerved him most was how the signal seemed to echo something buried deep within him, a history he couldn't quite place. "Send it to the fleet command," Kane ordered. "I want to know where it's coming from. Now." Westbrook nodded, quickly sending the signal off to the higher-ups. She was just about to look back at her console when a new anomaly appeared. This one, a sharp spike in the sensor readings, unlike anything Kane had ever seen. Before anyone could react, the ship's alarm system blared, drowning the room in a harsh mechanical sound. "Captain, it's not just a signal." Westbrook's voice shook as she glanced at the screen. "There's something there. Something massive." Kane's eyes widened as the coordinates popped up on the screen. The massive object was moving, and it wasn't far. The Hellraiser had returned. "Get the fleet ready," Kane ordered, his voice firm despite the icy chill spreading through his veins. "We're not dealing with a ghost. We're dealing with something that's been dead for centuries, and now it's alive. And I don't think it's here to negotiate." The Hellraiser appeared as a shadow at the edge of the solar system, a looming, silent behemoth that defied the natural order of space. At first, it was just a flicker on the radar, a speck that could have easily been mistaken for a distant asteroid. But as it drew closer, it became something more, a presence. Its massive form was shaped like an ancient warship, built for destruction, but it exuded an eerie, lifeless energy. There were no transmissions, no communications. It was as if the ship itself was waiting, watching, and making no effort to engage. Captain Marcus Kane stood in the war room, staring at the holoscreen, his mind racing. This ship, this Hellraiser, had been lost to history, a legend whispered in the deepest corners of military circles. Ancient texts and fragments of forgotten archives told tales of its immense power, a warship that had once been at the heart of a conflict so catastrophic it nearly tore the galaxy apart. The Hellraiser was said to have been piloted by a race of beings, the Xalari, whose ruthless nature was only matched by the terrifying technology they wielded. But how was it here? How had it survived? Captain, Lieutenant Westbrook's voice broke through his thoughts. The ship is powering up. Its energy cores are coming online. Kane's heart skipped a beat. The Hellraiser shouldn't even have power. It was an ancient relic, an artifact of a war long lost. Yet here it was, on the verge of awakening, as though the ship had never left. He could feel the weight of something ominous pressing down on him, an unsettling sensation that crawled along his skin. The ship's sudden activity could mean only one thing. This was no accident. "Open a comm channel," Kane ordered, his voice calm but firm. "Let's see if we can get a response." Westbrook nodded and keyed in the command. But the channel remained dead. There was no reply. The warship's weapons systems hummed to life, dark shapes shifting along its hull like dormant titans stirring from a long slumber. "We've tried everything, Captain," Westbrook said. "No communication. It's ignoring us." Kane's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. The Hellraiser wasn't just an ancient relic. It was something more, something dangerous, and it was pulling them in. Suddenly, alarms blared through the ship again, this time more urgent. The ship's sensors picked up an anomaly in the nearby asteroid field. The fleet had just entered a dangerous sector, but what they hadn't anticipated was the appearance of Xalari ships, rising from the shadows of the void. Their sleek, angular vessels warped the fabric of space around them, rippling with alien energy. A chill ran through the room. "They're here," Kane muttered, his voice low, realizing the truth in an instant. The Xalari had been waiting for the Hellraiser to return. They'd been tracking it, perhaps even guiding it back to this point. Their fleet had arrived not as conquerors, but as hunters. The warship, it seemed, was not just a weapon. It was a beacon, a lure, and now it had drawn them into a conflict that had been buried for centuries. "Prepare for battle," Kane ordered, his voice snapping into action. "Raise shields, ready the fleet's weapons, and get me a direct line to command. We need reinforcements, and we need them now." Westbrook's fingers flew over the controls, transmitting orders to the fleet. But even as they readied themselves for the inevitable fight, Kane felt the weight of something larger looming. The Hellraiser wasn't just a ship, it was the key to something far darker. The first blast from the Xalari fleet rang out across the void, a crackling bolt of energy that sent shockwaves through the human ships. The battle had begun. But Kane knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. And worse yet, the Hellraiser, that ancient weapon, was now a wild card, a force neither side could control. And it was coming for them all. The Xalari fleet, sleek and deadly, emerged from the void like predators stalking their prey. Their ships twisted the fabric of space around them, their dark energy signatures a clear sign of the alien power that coursed through them. The human fleet was caught off guard, unable to match the Xalari's maneuverability or firepower. The battle had started, and already the odds were stacked against them. Captain Marcus Kane stood at the center of the war room, his gaze fixed on the holoscreen as the first wave of Xalari ships closed in. Their weapons fired in quick succession, each blast hitting with the precision of a practiced hunter. Human ships exploded in showers of debris as they tried to retaliate, but their weapons were like needles against the Xalari's armored hulls. "Shields at 50%, Captain," shouted Lieutenant Westbrook from the communications console. Her voice was tight with stress as she relayed the updates. "Divert power to forward shields," Kane ordered, his mind racing. The Xalari were a force to be reckoned with, but he knew their greatest weapon wasn't just their technology. It was their ability to warp reality itself. The human fleet had to adapt, or they would be annihilated. "Captain, Hellraiser is reacting to the incoming fire," Westbrook said. "It's powering up its weapons systems. Its energy levels are spiking. We can't control it." Kane's heart skipped a beat. The Hellraiser, the warship they'd thought was an ancient relic, was now responding, its dormant systems awakening in the midst of a fight. But the ship wasn't acting under anyone's command. It was alive, and it was unpredictable. Set a course toward the HFY flagship, Kane barked, making a snap decision. If the Hellraiser was going to act on its own, they needed to direct it toward the heart of the enemy fleet. Get me control of its weapon systems. Sir, we can't, Westrook exclaimed, her fingers flying over the controls in a futile attempt to assert command over the rogue ship. It's locked us out. We're being overridden. Kane slammed his fist against the table. The Hellraiser had become more than a weapon. It was an enigma. The more they tried to control it, the more it resisted. But there was no time to waste. He needed that ship to fight for humanity, not against it. All ships, fall back and form a defensive perimeter around Hellraiser, Kane ordered. We'll use its firepower to buy us some time. As the human fleet regrouped, the Hellraiser opened fire, its massive guns unleashing waves of energy that cut through the advancing Salary ships with terrifying precision. The blasts were like thunder, lighting up the darkness of space. But Kane could see it. Each time the Hellraiser fired, there was a shift in its core, a distortion in the very fabric of space itself. Whatever power the ship was tapping into, it wasn't just destructive. It was unraveling the space around them, warping reality, bending the very laws of physics to its will. Captain, the Hellraiser's fire is distorting the space-time continuum. Westrook shouted, fear creeping into her voice. We're on the edge of a rift. If we don't disengage, we might get pulled into it. Kane cursed under his breath. The Hellraiser's power was beyond anything humanity had ever imagined. It wasn't just an old warship. It was a weapon of cosmic proportions, and it was getting out of control. Yet it was the only thing standing between them and complete annihilation. Pull back, all ships, Kane ordered again. We can't let the Hellraiser take us all down with it. But it was too late. The rift was widening, pulling the edges of space around them into a spiral. The HFY, too, seemed to be caught in its gravity, their ships disintegrating as they were dragged toward the rift's center. In the chaos, Kane's eyes locked on the approaching HFY flagship, a massive vessel, its form seemingly made of shadow and twisted light. The flagship's weapons powered up, and in a final act of defiance, it unleashed a beam of energy that ripped through the void, aimed directly at the Hellraiser. No, Kane shouted, his voice rising in desperation. The energy beam struck, and for a moment, everything went dark. The Hellraiser lurched as the beam from the HFY flagship struck its hull, a sudden shockwave that sent tremors through the ship. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, an eerie, oppressive stillness. The holoscreen flickered to life once more, revealing the damage. Deep cracks in the warship's outer shell, but no breach. It was as if the ship itself had absorbed the impact, surviving the impossible with a kind of unnatural resilience. Captain, Westrook's voice broke through the tension. We've lost communication with the fleet. We're flying blind. Kane's fists clenched. They were alone now, surrounded by the remnants of the battle, caught between two forces far beyond their control. The HFY and the Hellraiser, a weapon that even the best minds in the fleet couldn't begin to understand. Are we stable? Kane asked, his eyes narrowing on the flickering console in front of him. For now, Westrook replied, her tone sharp with anxiety. But the Hellraiser is fluctuating in power. I don't know how much longer it can hold together. The rift, it's still growing. If we don't find a way to shut it down. We're not done yet, Kane cut in, his voice a low growl. He wasn't ready to concede defeat. Not yet. We need to understand what we're dealing with. We have to find out why the Hellraiser and why the HFY are here. And we need to do it before we're swallowed up by that damn rift. Westrook looked at him, her expression conflicted. Captain, we don't have much time. The rift is expanding. And whatever this ship is, it's tied to the HFY. We need to know how to shut it down. Or, Kane knew what she was going to say. Or we all die. The truth had been hanging in the air like a storm cloud for hours. The Hellraiser wasn't just a warship. It was something much worse, something more dangerous than anything they'd encountered. And as Kane looked around at his crew, the weight of it settled upon him. They were fighting a war they didn't fully understand, against an enemy they couldn't predict. "Get to engineering," Kane ordered, making a decision. "Find the source of the Hellraiser's power. I need answers. Fast." In the depths of the ship's core, the situation was worse than anyone had anticipated. Commander Amelia Vance, Kane's second-in-command, had already started investigating the ancient warship's power grid. She had always been a pragmatist, but even she couldn't ignore the unease in her gut as she moved through the dark corridors of the Hellraiser. The ship had a mind of its own, and every instinct told her that it was alive, a dormant force just waiting to be unleashed. "What the hell is this?" Vance muttered under her breath as she passed by long-forgotten consoles that flickered to life with eerie precision. There was no logic to it, no reason why this ship should even function, and yet it was. It was responding to something or someone. She found what she was looking for deep in the core, where the Hellraiser's ancient engine thrummed with unearthly energy. The data panels showed strange readings, flashes of light, irregular patterns that suggested something was disrupting the space-time continuum itself. "What is it?" one of the engineers asked, fear creeping into his voice. Vance studied the glowing interface. "It's a weapon," she said softly, realization dawning. "Not just a ship. The Hellraiser is part of something bigger. It's connected to the Solaris technology. But this isn't just war. It's something far worse." The core thrummed again, and Vance felt a sudden chill. "We need to shut it down. Now." But just as she turned to leave, a voice echoed in her mind, a whisper so faint it could have been a trick of the ship's strange energy fields. She froze, her heart pounding. "We are the end." It was a voice, ancient and cold, a whisper from the ship itself. Vance staggered back, her breath catching. Whatever the Hellraiser was, it was more than a machine. It was a tomb, a prison, and a weapon all rolled into one. And its secrets were darker than anything they could have imagined. Back in the command center, Kane received Vance's transmission, her voice distorted by static and fear. "Captain, you need to hear this. The Hellraiser. It's not just a ship. It's a living weapon. It was designed to." The message cut out. Kane stood motionless, his heart pounding. What did she say? Before anyone could respond, a violent tremor shook the ship. The rift in space grew wider, its pull more insistent. Kane had seen what the Solaris were capable of. But now, he realized that the true enemy wasn't just the alien race. It was the Hellraiser itself. And it was calling out, waiting for something, waiting for the destruction it was always meant to deliver. The Hellraiser shook violently as the rift in space expanded, its jagged edges twisting the fabric of reality around them. Kane could feel the strain in his bones, the pressure of the space-time anomaly pressing in on them, warping the very air they breathed. Every passing second felt like an eternity as the ship groaned under the weight of forces it was never designed to contain. "Captain," Westbrook's voice was tight with panic. "The rift's growing faster now. If we don't act, it'll consume everything. The Hellraiser is pulling us toward its core. We're not just stuck in the rift's gravity. We're being pulled into the ship's singularity." Kane felt his stomach twist. The singularity. He had read about it in ancient reports, stories that had always seemed too fantastical to be true. The Hellraiser was more than just a warship. It was a weapon of cosmic destruction. If it activated its singularity core, it could tear apart entire systems, collapse stars, and unravel the fabric of reality itself. "How long do we have?" Kane asked, trying to maintain his composure despite the growing sense of dread gnawing at him. "Not long," Westbrook replied, her hands flying over her controls in a desperate attempt to stabilize their trajectory. "Maybe minutes. We need to get out of the ship's pull, or we'll be dragged into the singularity and..." Before she could finish, the lights flickered, and the ship trembled again. A low, guttural hum echoed through the walls of the Hellraiser, almost like a heartbeat, a pulse of energy that reverberated throughout the entire vessel. It was as if the ship itself was awakening, responding to the rift, feeding off its energy. "Captain, we're being intercepted," shouted Lieutenant Vance, her voice crackling with static as she sent an urgent transmission from engineering. "The core's destabilizing. It's like it's rejecting the power source we've been trying to reroute. The Hellraiser is alive, Kane. It doesn't want us here. We need to disconnect from the core." Kane's mind raced. The ship, alive, rejecting control, was something out of his worst nightmares. He had known from the moment the Hellraiser had fired on the Salary that it wasn't just a ship. But now, the truth was undeniable. They weren't dealing with a lost artifact. They were dealing with a force beyond their understanding, and it was turning against them. "We can't pull out of the core, Captain." Vance's voice came again, more desperate this time. "The rift is feeding it power. If we try to disconnect, the ship will collapse in on itself. It'll trigger a chain reaction and pull everything into the singularity." Kane turned to Westbrook, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The crew's safety, the fate of humanity, the war that was about to unfold. "What options do we have left?" Kane asked, his voice calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. Westbrook swallowed hard, her fingers hovering over the console. "If we can't disconnect from the core, our only chance is to use the Hellraiser's weapon systems to fire on the rift itself. We've got to destabilize it, or it'll keep growing until it swallows us all." But she didn't need to finish. They both knew what needed to be done, and it was a long shot. "I don't like it," Kane muttered, his thoughts moving faster than his words. "But we don't have a choice." "Sir," Westbrook said, her voice taking on a more determined edge, "we need to target the center of the rift. It's the only way to stop the expansion before it's too late." "Do it," Kane ordered, steel in his voice. "All ships, prepare to fire on my mark. We'll use the Hellraiser to end this, no matter the cost." Westbrook nodded, her face pale as she relayed the order to the fleet. As the weapons systems of the Hellraiser came online, Kane's heart raced. They were about to use the ship's catastrophic power as a weapon of salvation, and there was no telling what would happen if they failed. But just as they were about to fire, a pulse of energy from the rift shot out, crashing into the Hellraiser's hull. The entire ship trembled, and a wave of energy rippled through space, distorting the surroundings like a shattered mirror. "Captain, it's too strong," Westbrook shouted, her hands scrambling to regain control of the ship's systems. "We can't stabilize the weapons. We're losing power." Kane clenched his jaw, fighting against the rising panic. They were on the verge of losing everything. "Reroute all power to the main cannon," Kane barked. "We can't afford failure now." But as the Hellraiser powered up, something unexpected happened. The ship seemed to resonate with the rift's energy, amplifying it rather than negating it. The singularity at the heart of the rift pulsed brighter, its gravitational field growing more unstable. And in the heart of that maelstrom, Kane realized the truth. The Hellraiser had never been intended to destroy the rift. It was the key to opening it. "Captain," Westbrook gasped, "it's not us controlling the Hellraiser anymore. It's the rift. The ship's being." Before she could finish, the ship lurched again, this time violently, and the Hellraiser seemed to merge with the rift itself, a final, cataclysmic collision of forces beyond human comprehension. And then, everything went dark. Kane's mind was spinning, the darkness closing in around him. One moment, the crew had been fighting to regain control of the Hellraiser, and now, it was as if the entire universe had folded in on itself. The ship lurched once more, throwing him off his feet. He hit the deck hard, his vision blurring as the echoes of the rift's energy continued to reverberate through the ship's very structure. "Report," Kane barked, trying to shake off the dizziness. The oppressive silence that followed only deepened his dread. "Sir," Westbrook's voice was weak, barely audible over the low hum of the ship. We're not in real space anymore." Kane forced himself to sit up, struggling to find his bearings. The war room was in chaos. Consoles were flickering, alarms blaring intermittently. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if they were no longer within the ship but somewhere beyond the realm of comprehension. Through the viewports, there was no sign of the familiar stars, only an endless swirling void, a darkness that seemed to pulse with unnatural energy. "We've crossed into another dimension." Vance's voice came through the static. "This isn't just the rift. It's something else. It's alive." Alive. Kane's blood ran cold. The rift, the Hellraiser, the Xalari, none of this was mere coincidence. The ship had become a vessel for something greater, something ancient. And now, they were all trapped in it. "Get to the core," Kane ordered, his voice low but firm, as he regained his footing. "We need to stop the Hellraiser from feeding the rift. If we don't, there's no going back." In engineering, Vance and the crew scrambled to reach the central power grid. The ship felt different now. An almost oppressive energy radiated from the walls. The corridors were unnaturally silent, save for the faint echoes of their footsteps. Vance felt it, the sensation of being watched, the unmistakable feeling of something lurking in the shadows of the ship, something that wasn't human or even alien. "Commander, look at this," one of the engineers whispered, his face pale as he pointed at a glowing interface. The display was showing data that was incomprehensible to them. Twisted symbols, patterns that didn't align with any known language or code. And at the center of it all was a single word, written in symbols that pulsed with a sickly light: Elder. Vance's heart skipped a beat. Elder? Was it referring to the ancient beings the Xalari had warned about? The ones they'd said had been sealed away for eternity. "Commander," the engineer said, his voice trembling, This ship is more than a weapon. It's a prison." Back in the war room, Kane was piecing together the grim reality. The Hellraiser had not only been a weapon of unimaginable power, it had been the prison for a force older than time itself. The ship had been designed to contain this power, a being, an entity that existed outside the fabric of the universe. The rift had been the catalyst for its return. And now, they were all locked in its grip. "Captain," Westbrook said, her voice shaky but determined, "we need to find a way to sever the connection between the Hellraiser and the rift. It's like the ship is a conduit, and every time it feeds off the rift, it's getting stronger. If we don't act, this thing, whatever it is, will break free, and we won't be able to stop it." Kane nodded, his face grim. "I know, but the Hellraiser isn't just the conduit, it's the prison. The creature that's been sealed away is using the ship to regain its power. We need to shut it down, completely, before it consumes everything." They were fighting not just for their lives, but for the very existence of their reality. The Hellraiser had become the linchpin in a war against a force that had no place in their universe. "Do we have a plan?" Westbrook asked, her voice tense with uncertainty. Vance's voice crackled through the comm. "The only option is to overload the core. If we can get enough power into the engine, it might create a reversal, a cascade that could collapse the ship and sever its connection to the rift. But it's a long shot." "We don't have a choice," Kane said, his gaze hardening with resolve. "Get it done, Commander." The crew worked feverishly, trying to reverse the flow of energy, reroute power, and prep the engines for overload. The Hellraiser groaned around them, its walls seemingly alive with dark energy, pulsing and shifting as if it were aware of their every move. As they reached the core, Vance felt something, or rather, someone, brush against her mind. A presence. Ancient. Malevolent. "Release me." She froze. The voice, a deep guttural whisper, seemed to come from every corner of the ship. It was the entity, the thing imprisoned within the Hellraiser. Its power was leaking out, and Vance could feel it, crawling along her skin, digging into her thoughts. "No," she whispered to herself, trying to shake the voice from her mind. But the presence lingered, growing stronger. She wasn't just fighting to save the ship anymore. She was fighting to keep her sanity intact. The stakes had never been higher. Time was running out. The Hellraiser was slipping further into the void, taking them all with it. And if they couldn't sever the connection soon, the entity within would break free, and nothing would survive. Kane stood at the edge of the command deck, staring at the ever-expanding rift, knowing that the final confrontation was about to begin. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting to preserve the very fabric of existence itself. The hum of the Hellraiser was deafening now, vibrating through every surface, every wall. Kane could feel it in his chest, that unnatural pulse, like the heartbeat of something ancient and monstrous. It was getting stronger by the second. The presence, it was growing. And so was the rift. The boundaries between dimensions were slipping, and they were caught in the center of it. "Captain," Westbrook said, her voice tight with urgency, "we're running out of time. The entity is pushing against the ship's containment systems. If we don't stop it now, it'll break free. There's no telling what it'll do once it's unleashed." Kane's fists tightened. The reality of the situation was clear. They were racing against an entity older than time itself, and if they failed, the universe as they knew it would cease to exist. "Commander Vance, status report," Kane called out, his voice a steady command amidst the chaos. Vance's voice came through, strained. "We're almost there, Captain. The core's been set for overload, but I'm not sure how much longer we can keep the containment in place. The rift's feeding the Hellraiser's power like it's nothing. It's as if the ship's alive, pulling from the rift directly. It's evolving." "Don't stop," Kane urged, his heart hammering in his chest. He was torn between the need to end the threat and the fear of what would happen if they pushed too far. But there was no other choice. In engineering, Vance and her team were fighting against the clock, surrounded by flickering lights and the overwhelming hum of the ship's energy fields. The core thrummed louder, like a drumbeat of impending doom. It was all they could do to keep the energy flows in check. But each second that passed, the core became more unstable, the gravitational forces warping and bending everything in their path. Come on," Vance muttered, her eyes scanning the diagnostic screen. "We need one more push, one final override. Just a few more seconds." The presence was closer now, its whispers flooding her mind. "Release me." She gritted her teeth, trying to block it out. But the voice was relentless. The entity was feeding off her fear, growing stronger, bending her thoughts to its will. The power flowing through the Hellraiser was beyond anything she had ever imagined, an energy so ancient it felt like it came from beyond the stars themselves. "Vance, focus," another engineer snapped, trying to break her from the trance. "We don't have time to listen to it. We've got to finish this." With shaking hands, Vance input the final command. Back on the bridge, Kane was pacing, his mind whirling. The ship was dying. The rift was expanding, pulling them further into the abyss. The warship's systems were fighting to maintain their integrity, but it was a losing battle. Every inch closer to the rift felt like they were being swallowed alive. "Captain," Westbrook said again, her voice barely audible over the ship's loud rumbling. "I can feel it. The Hellraiser is alive. It's resonating with the rift. It's not just a weapon. It's the key, the rift and the entity. They're part of it. The ship is a bridge." Kane stopped pacing and looked her square in the eyes. "What are you saying?" "This ship is the rift." Westbrook hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, the Hellraiser wasn't just a warship. It was built as a prison, sure, but it was also designed to control the rift. It was never meant to contain the entity forever. It was meant to harness it, to feed off the rift's power. And now, it's feeding too much." Kane's stomach twisted. "And if we overload it, if we destroy the ship, Westbrook grimaced. We sever the connection to the rift. But we're gambling everything. If the ship goes down, so does the entity. Kane was silent for a moment. If they failed, the entity would be free to destroy everything. But if they succeeded, the entire ship and the rift would collapse into nothingness, taking the universe with it. This is it, Kane said, his voice grim. Prepare for the overload. We'll take it down together. In the core, Vance and the engineers braced themselves for the final push. The ship's structure was groaning under the pressure. Every system was straining against the sheer volume of energy coursing through it. Commander, we can't keep this up. One of the engineers shouted, his voice cracking with fear. We're losing control. If we push any harder, we'll trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. Vance's hand hovered over the final button. The Hellraiser was on the edge of collapse. The rift was inches from swallowing them all. And then the whispers came again. Release me. No, Vance shouted, her voice full of resolve. She slammed her hand onto the override. A surge of energy exploded from the core, shaking the ship. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the rift seemed to contract, flickering as though the entire dimension was about to collapse. But then the Hellraiser roared to life. A blinding pulse of light shot through the ship as the core overloaded, a final act of defiance. The ship's systems went haywire, sparks flying from every console, the structure vibrating violently as the entity's power reached its peak. The walls around Vance buckled as the ship's pulse grew louder. Brace for impact, she shouted to her crew. Kane stood on the bridge, watching in horror as the Hellraiser buckled under the pressure, the rift growing ever larger. The force of the overload was too great. They had pushed the ship to the limit. Now, Kane shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. Activate all ship-wide energy protocols. Focus on the core. Everything we have now. The ship's remaining energy surged toward the center, as the crew's last-ditch effort to sever the rift was launched. The final countdown had begun. Either they succeeded, or they would all be consumed in the ultimate collapse of reality. The Hellraiser shuddered as if in agony, the ship groaning under the weight of its own destruction. Energy surged through its hull, a violent pulse that rattled the crew's bones and made the lights flicker erratically. Kane's hands clenched into fists, his pulse hammering in his ears. The moment they'd been dreading, the final confrontation, was upon them. Sir, Westbrook's voice cut through the tension, her words steady despite the chaos around them. The rift is collapsing. The overload is working. But the entity, it's fighting back. Kane's gaze was fixed on the viewports, where the rift pulsed in violent waves, its edges sparking with raw, chaotic energy. The being imprisoned within the Hellraiser was angry. It was clawing at reality itself, desperate to break free. Can we stabilize the energy flow? Kane asked, trying to maintain his composure. His fingers gripped the edge of his command chair as the ship groaned louder, the very foundations of the Hellraiser threatening to tear apart. Westbrook's face was pale, her brow furrowed in concentration. We're feeding the core everything we have, but it's too unstable. The ship is siphoning energy from the rift, and the overload is making the connection stronger, not weaker. We're on the verge of a total collapse. Then we have no choice, Kane said, his voice cold, resigned. We must cut the ship off entirely. If the Hellraiser goes, the rift goes with it. In engineering, Vance and her team were nearly spent. The ship was shaking uncontrollably now. Sparks flew from every console, and the air was thick with the smell of burning circuits. The core was overheating, and the rift, still expanding, began to warp the entire ship's structure. It's too much, one of the engineers shouted over the din. We're losing everything if we don't disconnect from the rift. But Vance wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind. They were at the precipice, the final decision hanging over them. They could try to shut down the ship, but the rift's energy was too vast. The ship's systems were entwined with it, and they couldn't just cut themselves free without taking everything with them. She turned to her crew, determination setting in her eyes. "We're going to overload the core. We're going to make the Hellraiser implode. And we're taking the rift with us." The engineers nodded, grim but resolute. They were all in this together, bound by the same knowledge. If they didn't act now, there would be no tomorrow. Back on the bridge, Kane's heart thundered in his chest. Every second felt like an eternity as the countdown clock ticked ever closer to zero. The ship trembled once again, and the rift expanded, its fiery tendrils reaching out as if trying to consume everything. "Captain," Westbrook said, her voice tight, "we've diverted everything we have. This is it. We need to activate the final sequence. Now." Kane nodded, locking eyes with her. The weight of the decision was heavy, but they had no more time to debate. "Do it," he commanded, his voice unwavering. Westbrook's hands flew over the console, inputting the final command. The ship groaned louder, the sounds of strain reverberating through the hull. Kane could feel it in his bones, the finality of their actions. The Hellraiser screamed as it reached the peak of its power. The overload had begun, a chain reaction that was slowly but surely destabilizing everything. For a brief, fleeting moment, the rift flickered, as if it was on the verge of collapsing in on itself. The ship's core crackled, a blinding light shooting out from its heart, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Then came the explosion. It wasn't a loud blast, but a wave, a shockwave of pure, unbridled energy that radiated out from the core. The Hellraiser's hull cracked like glass, its twisted form collapsing inward. The entity's scream echoed in the void, a sound that was not of this world, but of another, a voice of eternal rage and hunger. The ship folded in on itself, its connection to the rift severed in one final, desperate act. The rift began to collapse with it, its edges collapsing inwards like a dying star. For a moment, there was silence. The ship's systems had gone dark, the warning lights now extinguished. Kane felt a deep, hollow emptiness in his chest as the shaking of the Hellraiser ceased. He dared not move, not yet. He didn't want to believe it. "Captain," Westbrook said, her voice shaking with disbelief. I think we did it." Kane stepped slowly to the viewports, looking out at the rift, which was now nothing more than a faint glimmer, a dying ember of a power that had once been unstoppable. The endless void that had threatened to consume them all was gone, and with it, the entity. But the cost was immense. The Hellraiser, their ship, was no more. The rift had been sealed, but the toll it had taken on the crew, on the very fabric of space and time, was immeasurable. The void that had existed within the ship's core, within the rift itself, was gone. But so was the Hellraiser. "We've stopped it," Kane said, his voice hollow. "But at what cost?" Westbrook stood beside him, her eyes locked on the viewports. "We did what we had to do, Captain. We saved everything. But it's over." In engineering, Vance's team had already begun to assess the aftermath, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. The ship was gone, but they were alive. They had succeeded in their mission, though none of them would ever forget the horrors they'd faced. "We're still here," Vance whispered, her eyes scanning the wreckage around them. "But we can't ever forget what happened here." The final battle was over, and the Hellraiser was no more. But Kane knew that the echoes of this war would stay with them forever. The rift had been sealed, the entity locked away once again. And yet, as he stood in the silent aftermath, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there, waiting for its chance to break free. The warship had returned, and though the threat was gone, they had learned one undeniable truth. Nothing truly dies in the void. It only waits.